This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we've got some big updates on an issue that we've been tracking closely, and that is congressional and legislative maps ahead of November's election. So, the news here is in South Carolina and Florida and North Carolina. So, first, South Carolina, because I think this is the biggest piece of news. What happened there?
This is an absolute outrage. The people of South Carolina went to elections in 2022 under what a three-judge federal court has said were unconstitutional maps. Black voters in Nancy Mace's district were forced to vote and be represented by a map that violates their constitutional right against racial gerrymandering. And this case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and both the state of South Carolina and the plaintiff said, hey, Supreme Court, we need an answer by January 1. Okay. Now, this was plenty of time because the Supreme Court at this point was hearing oral argument in this case in October. And not only didn't they give them an answer by January 1 or by February 1 or March 1, they didn't even give them an answer by April 1. So right now, the state of South Carolina has gone back to the federal court and gotten the federal court to agree that the state of South Carolina gets to use the unconstitutional map again in 2024, while we all sit around and wait for the U.S. Supreme Court to decide this case. Meanwhile, they expedite the cases that they want to. The one, Donald Trump wanted an answer quickly in Colorado about whether he was disqualified under the 14th Amendment. He got it. Doesn't want a quick answer in the immunity case. That case is not set until the last day of argument. And meanwhile, this South Carolina case languished. It is an absolute outrage, and it is something that we need to find a way to put an end to.
Well, you just alluded to this. The Supreme Court is capable of issuing rulings quickly. Like we've seen it this very cycle. We even saw it in 2000 during the Bush-Gore election, where they had only a couple of days to make a decision. So knowing the urgency of this issue, what's their excuse for not acting on this sooner?
There isn't one. I mean, this is the thing. I was talking to someone about this the other day, an academic, and I fear we are starting to see a new era in which the U.S. Supreme Court uses its power of time and timing to effectively affect the outcome of the election of election-related rulings. It's interesting you mentioned Bush versus Gore, because it never occurred to anyone, whether you were on the Bush side or the Gore side, it never occurred to anyone that the U.S. Supreme Court would just sort of delay that out right, and therefore affect the outcome of the ruling. Like, they heard that case quickly. And if it were just South Carolina, I'd say, okay, something glitched here and there must be something going on. But Brian, remember, we saw this in Alabama, right? The Alabama map was struck down in time for the 2022 election, and the Supreme Court delayed that through 2024. Now, the voters of Alabama will go and have fair maps in 2024, but they could have had them in 2022. Same in Louisiana. And we saw the same thing there. And of course, in this immunity case, where the Supreme Court has this case from the DC Circuit, which is an absolute joke of a case. I mean, Donald Trump does not have a prayer of winning this case in the U.S. Supreme Court, even with a conservative bench. It's almost like there are forces on the Supreme Court that are using the timing of the decision, their power to control the timing to effectuate an outcome.
And the crazy part about this is that there are actual real life implications as the result of this. I mean, you mentioned Alabama and Louisiana. Republicans will have a 1-seat majority in the House right now. Those two seats are the difference between a Democratic majority and a Republican majority. So right now, the Republicans' majority is owed entirely to the fact that they have illegal maps that they were allowed to use because no courts would act quickly enough to actually put a remedial map in place.
But, well, it's actually worse than that. It's because the U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't let the courts put a remedial map in place.
Right, right. They wanted to.
They wanted to, right? The Alabama court was all ready to roll. And it was the U.S. Supreme Court that put a stay in place to prevent that from happening. So like I said, I am worrying that, we went through an era of the Supreme Court having a high level of credibility, the most, along with the U.S. military, viewed as the most highly respected nonpartisan body of the federal government. Then we had Dobbs. They had lost some credibility before that. Then we had Dobbs. Now we are starting to see, I worry, this new era in which a minority of the court is able to use the calendar as a weapon to prevent justice, whether it's this case in South Carolina, the cases we talked about last term, which, as you point out, is the difference between Speaker Jeffries right now and Speaker Johnson. Let's be clear. Right now, because of the narrow margins, that is the difference. But, we're now going to also see this play out in the criminal case for Donald Trump.
And they'll keep using this. They'll keep putting forward illegal maps, getting them passed by Republican-led legislatures, knowing that they've got at least a cycle before the courts are actually willing to do anything about it because, they're all on the same side. And so even though they're blatantly illegal on their faces, they know that they've got a free pass for at least one cycle before they get pushed back. And in the meantime, 4 other states will do the same thing. And so we're just in this constant push and pull, I should say, where they put forward illegal maps, they get built-in delays by the court system that is politically and ideologically aligned with them, and then eventually they'll get it clawed back. But for every one that's swatted down, 2 more will pop up.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about this on Democracy Docket for our members that courts know how to move fast and courts know how to move slow. And the courts that have moved slow in recent weeks and months have had as much impact on the outcome of the case as the actual decision in the case. And the courts that have moved fast, and there have been some courts that have moved fast, they have brought justice for voters in a way that would not have been the case if they have moved slow.
You brought up Democracy Docket. I would just mention for anybody watching right now, if you're not yet subscribed to Democracy Docket, it's the free news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting and elections. It's a great resource. I use it on a daily basis. So if you're not yet signed up, I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Marc, we've also been tracking Florida's 5th congressional district, which is also racially gerrymandered, and yet a federal 3-judge panel upheld that the districts as they were should stand. What happened here, and will this case be appealed?
This is such an odd decision. I have to say, this is not a case I'm involved in. I'm involved in a parallel case that my firm is involved in a parallel case that is before the Florida State Supreme Court, which I'm happy to talk about. But it's a very odd decision here because, in a racial gerrymandering case, what you're trying to prove is that the map was the product of racial stereotyping or the movement of a significant number of Black voters, in this case, in and out of district on racial grounds. And what the court found is that actually was true with respect to Ron DeSantis, that Ron DeSantis, the governor, proposed this map, and it was, in fact, based on racial grounds. But their argument was that the legislature itself didn't have that racial motivation. Only the governor did. Well, I mean, that's kind of a pretty big loophole. I mean, if that's the rule, that somehow the governor, that states can evade racial gerrymandering claims by just having the governor do the racial gerrymandering, when after all, the governor has to sign the bills, right? I mean, like he's part of the legislative process too. That can't be right. So we'll see whether or not this goes up on appeal. In the meantime, as I mentioned, there is a parallel state case that is pending before the Florida State Supreme Court. And before people give up on the Florida Supreme Court, yes, the Florida Supreme Court just ruled a terrible outcome with respect to abortion, but it also ruled that the ballot initiative in Florida can go forward. And I predicted that was going to be the case. That this Florida Supreme Court is a little less beholden to Ron DeSantis than it was before he ran for president. There is a schism in that Republican Party in that state, with Trump forces on one side and DeSantis on the other. And it would not shock me if the Florida Supreme Court, when it rules on that Florida 5th congressional district case, if it comes out on the side that it did, like it did in the ballot initiative case, and actually strikes down that map, because it would be a real black eye to Ron DeSantis for it to do that.
And finally, North Carolina's state Senate districts are also alleged to violate the Voting Rights Act. Why won't those be rectified in time for November?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're like replaying the same movie over and over again, right? The legislature in North Carolina engaged in an absolutely obscene map drawing process, knowing that it would get away with it, or thinking it would get away with it, because the state Supreme Court had flipped from pro-democracy to a majority Republican appointees. So it kind of pinned its ears back and just went for a full gerrymander. It violated the Voting Rights Act, but we're now at this place where it's too late, right? Everyone's now like, well, it's too late. So these poor Black voters in the Senate district, who brought what I think are a pretty good claim, wind up not getting relief in 2024.
Are there any other maps that you're tracking ahead of November, or are all of the maps that are in place right now going to be the ones that are used in November?
Look, there are other cases I'm following for sure. You know, I'm following Texas. That's a big case we haven't talked about in a long time. You're talking about as many as 5 or 6 districts that could be redrawn, but that's not going to be in time for 2024. Utah, there's a case, really interesting case in the state Supreme Court that could happen, but that's not going to be in time for 2024. So I think where we are is unfortunately where we're going to be. And Republicans have just perfected this idea that they can delay, delay, delay. And look, this is starting from the top down. Donald Trump, as we sit here, is still delaying the criminal case in Florida. He is still trying to figure out a way to delay the New York case that's set to go to trial in a
Like
little over
two
a week.
weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so this is their strategy. Their strategy is to achieve practical results by courts not ruling. And I wish I could say the courts were up to it, but and I wrote about this for Democracy Docket a few weeks ago, specifically with respect to Trump. It's not clear the courts are up for it. It's not clear the courts are standing up to these delay tactics, as we see Donald Trump and the Republican Party use them.
Which of course underscores the need for a Voting Rights Act, and the only party that's going to be able to pass something like that is Democrats. So just something to keep in mind ahead of this election. Also to keep in mind is that, for all of the cases that Mark and his team and other plaintiffs have won ahead of this 2024 election, including the ones in Alabama, in Louisiana, the ones that we've spoken about in New York, and on, we have more cases pending for 2026 that will be in place. So, for the fact that the map is a little bit better, that we have a little bit of relief in some of these states now in 2024, there are still cases that will likely be resolved in Democrats' favor, in the pro-democracy faction's favor ahead of this next congressional cycle. So things will continue to change. We'll continue to claw back whatever, wins we can where we can get them.
The fight that goes on in many of these cases, particularly in redistricting cases, but even in voting cases, is very much a 2-year fight, right? You are fighting for the next election. I sometimes used to say, before Donald Trump, we're never more than 2 years away from the most important election of our lifetime. Now,
Yeah.
The truth is that with Donald Trump on the ballot, that's actually not a joke anymore. That's true. But, the House of Representatives is going to be decided by a few thousand votes in a handful of districts. The presidency of the United States is going to be decided by a few thousand votes in a handful of states. The U.S. Senate's going to be decided by a few thousand votes in a handful of states. And so each of these cases has a really, really big impact on who controls power in 2025, but then immediately those fights don't end, right? I mean,
Right.
Those fights don't end. We continue to see redistricting cases every 2 years of the 10-year cycle. We continue to see voting cases every year of year in, year out, because we are locked in this fight between democracy and autocracy, between people who want to expand voting rights and people who believe their only future is in contracting voting rights, people who want to promote confidence in our election system, and people who are committed to the big lie and election denialism. And I wish I could say, as you and I have been doing this now for, episode after episode, that we are closer to the end than the beginning, but I don't think that's true. I think we will be talking about this for the months and the years to come, because the fight for democracy is the fight of our generation. It is the fight of our time. It is not necessarily the fight we wanted, but it is the fight we have, and we have to win it.
And for those watching right now, of course, I think it's not lost on any of us that this fight is largely taking place in the courts. So, for those looking to support Mark and his team and the invaluable work that they are doing right now in the courts, and that they'll continue to do as we move forward, again, please sign up for Democracy Docket. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.